Hey, welcome here to another episode of the Peanut Gallery. Thanks, Sarah, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
My guests are always, I'm not sure everybody's always excited to be here, so sometimes they're just kind of like, yeah, I got suckered into this. Very excited about this week. So this week, we have decided we wanted to focus on dealing with grief. Grief is something that over the last year we've spent a lot of time talking about as the world has grieved. And for some, that is loss of people through COVID. For some of it's loss of opportunities, loss of jobs, loss of freedoms, all those things. So grief has been a big thing, but grief is something that we as humans don't necessarily do well. It doesn't come natural to us. It's a very difficult thing. We all are aware that we're mortal. We're very aware of that, but that doesn't make death any easier. And so today and then the next podcast, we want to talk about grief. And so one of the ways that we felt like doing it instead of just talking through theory is ask some really good friends of ours to come on and share their stories. And so, Sarah, thanks for joining us. Again, I am very excited that you said yes. One of the things I do want to say up front, just as a very clear warning, today's podcast can be difficult to listen to. And so for those of you guys who are potentially going to be triggered, I want you to be aware. We talk about death and we talk about loss of a child. And so we want to give people that awareness and that disclaimer. And so again, if you are moved by this podcast, if you want to talk further, you can always reach out to us as a church. I'm not going to give Sarah's number out publicly, but I'm sure she'd be willing to meet as well. And we certainly are. So if you are triggered by this, make sure you reach out. But with that, Sarah, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself before we get into really the story, but tell us a little bit about you, your family, who you are, weirdest quirk. I don't know what you all want to share.
Weirdest quirk. Wow, I don't even know where to go with that one. But I am married to George. We met when I was 16, got married a few years later, got married way too young.
How old were you?
I was 18, and I married an old guy. He was like 25, so yeah. We have 4 children. We have 2 beautiful grandchildren that we absolutely love. It's been a joy watching our kids, but our grandchildren especially.
Yeah, I've heard at least grandkids are phenomenal.
If somebody said if you could only bypass kids and go straight to grandkids, right? Like there's some truth to that.
But would you appreciate them that much? And now,
no,
right?
You
like
wouldn't.
I feel like they.
No.
All right. So you've been married for almost 30 years, you said, right?
Coming up in April.
Which is incredible. Absolutely incredible. So congrats on that. We'll come back to that yet. I think anytime you get to 30 years is pretty cool.
It is. It really is.
But with some of the stuff you guys have been through, I think it speaks even more to how amazing it is that you guys are together and still in love and cute together.
And still, yeah, by the grace of God, right?
Yeah. All right, so let's get to this story. Why don't you tell us the story of your daughter and a little bit before and whatever else you're able to share.
All right. Like Albert said, my name is Sarah, and if you are a parent, I am living your worst nightmare. On September 19th, 1996, I walked outside to find the lifeless body of my 3-year-old daughter. She was airlifted to the hospital, and upon our arrival, we were escorted to a small room where a doctor came and told us they had been unable to resuscitate her. Those words and my scream still echo in my ears. My little Veronica had a love affair with shoes, heels, flip-flops, work boots, anything and everything, as long as they weren't her own. Those never stayed on her feet. A little side note, we found so many of her shoes after her death all over the place. Her obsession with shoes, a love for the great outdoors, and a tired mama's, "Go ahead, I'll be right out." On her way out, she slipped on a pair of flip-flops about 4 sizes too big, walked over to a car with a partially rolled down window, threw one flip-flop in, and apparently regretted it instantly. In her effort to see where it had disappeared to, she stepped onto the car's trim to gain leverage and was able to stick her head through the window to peek into the car before she lost her footing, effectively cutting off all blood supply to the brain. That singular event marked the timeline and the sense of my life, a very distinct before and after. The before was filled with a healthy marriage, work that we enjoyed, 2 beautiful children, and the bigger community of family and friends. The after left us destroyed. A 3-year-old permeates your life, as every parent of a preschooler will tell you. It's a time of wonder and learning and discovery, of absolute trust. The sudden loss of that presence in our home is a grief that words can't do justice to. On our way home from the hospital, one of the only things George and I talked about was how fortunate that Brandon, our baby, was only 16 months and too young to be impacted much. We had no idea how wrong we were. He was, in fact, so traumatized by what he had seen that he had to be sedated before he could sleep again. He just refused to close his eyes. My mom talks about how she took him to Sunday school, and he would walk from little girl to little girl, searching for his sister. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. That nursery rhyme ran through my mind like a broken record, broken into a million pieces, forced into a desert of grief where I didn't want to be, and most decidedly didn't choose to be. My journey in this desert of grief was long and intense, and it was also a very lonely journey, but God showed up. And today I want to share some of the ways that he showed up. One of the big ones for me was I learned to claim God's promises. I quickly found out that my primary way of processing was through words, not surprising since I've always had a love for reading. The Psalms became my prayers when I couldn't find words. Job, Lamentations, every verse I could find that gave voice to my grief, probably taken out of context many, many times, but truthfully, it just didn't matter. I needed those words. And with that, I learned to pray, to take a promise that God made and to literally pray that over myself. I remember one particularly rough day at work. I had escaped outside to trying to get my emotions back under control enough to get back to work. And as I sat there sobbing, I remember crying out, God, you promised comfort. Where is my comfort? I felt a shift of the truck and a hand settle on my shoulder, and I looked over to see who had joined me. There was no one there that I could see. But the comfort I felt deep inside was real. And to this day, I believe God showed up. God showing up isn't always this dramatic, but God doesn't make empty promises. And in reminding myself of God's promises, I'm reminded of his promises and his character, and it restores hope and peace in my life, and in yours if you want him to. Another tool that God taught me was music. I love music. But I gained a whole new appreciation for it in the years following Veronica's death. God so often used the lyrics of a song to comfort, to teach, and once again for me to learn to verbalize my feelings in order to process and lament my grief. There are 2 songs I'll mention here that stayed on my playlist a long time. The first one, I don't know where or who it's from, but one of the lines says, "Who will hold her hand when she crosses the streets of heaven?" That, in a nutshell, sums up one of my demons. The other one is a Stephen Curtis Chapman song that he wrote after his daughter's death called My God is in Control. It talks about how God sorry.
I've been crying this whole time, so you're fine. You're doing great.
It's a song called My God is in Control, and it talks about how this is not how it should be, but this is how it is, and my God is still in control. And though there is no understanding of it now, someday we'll stand before him and we'll really understand. But for now, we'll sing Holy, Holy while we wait for that day. One day I will either understand, or maybe it just won't matter anymore. But until then, I choose to trust. Because isn't that what trust and faith is? I may not understand, but I trust my Jesus, my Father God. The other one I want to touch on is forgiveness and grace. My daughter's death was completely preventable. And although it was ruled an accidental death, following the investigation, I will always live with that regret. You see, I let her go outside ahead of me. In the culture and environment I grew up in, that was a completely normal thing to do. But the reality of it is, I failed her. Forgiving myself, especially in this, is hard, and it still rears its ugly head periodically. Jesus talks about how there is nothing that can separate us from his love, and the grace he offers me has been instrumental in giving myself grace. Along with learning to forgive myself was learning to forgive others. There's an old saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. I find that to be fundamentally untrue. Right. Words can be both life-giving and destructive. And in our need to say something, each one of us will, at times, say something that is hurtful or destructive, and often both. For instance, one person said to me, "Aren't you thankful it was your daughter you lost and not your husband? I think losing a partner would be way harder." How do you even respond to something like that? I was left with two choices: to take offense at the way it trivialized and compared, or I could offer the same grace that Jesus offers me so many times. He looks past my actions and my words to my heart and gives me grace upon grace. How can I do any less? But my God said no. My God said no at a time when I begged him for a yes. If you asked me what your message was this past Sunday, I couldn't tell you.
Most people couldn't.
But it triggered a reaction where I recognized that God saying no to our desperate prayers to breathe life back into our little girl's body had resulted in me believing that I was less loved. But as distinctly as you please, I heard Jesus say, "My no was not because I love you less." My God is not a fairy God. He is not the God I thought he was. And I've wrestled with whether he is a good God and if he can be trusted. There are times he feels so very far away. Other times his presence is so very real. Sometimes we have a conversation. Other times every word seems to hit the ceiling. But none of that changes who my Jesus is. My Jesus offers hope where there is none. He gives comfort and has healed me from trauma in a way that I haven't even begun to touch on. My Jesus is real in a way that is so hard to define, and yet it defines me. I owe my very life to Jesus at a time when the darkness was so very overwhelming that taking my own life became a viable option. It was Jesus who gave me the courage to keep on fighting and to not let the darkness consume me. It's going to be 25 years this fall since that fateful day. I will always miss my firstborn. If you ask me how many children I have, I will pause a split second before answering. It's inevitably a reminder of what we've lost. 25 years, and not a day goes by that she doesn't cross my mind. And that's okay. Grief and joy live side by side in my life. And in the missing, there is a reminder to celebrate and enjoy the here and now, to love deeply, and to give freely.
I'm not often at much of a lack for words, but good night. Thank you, sir. So now I got to regain my own composure.
Okay, in the meantime, I want to talk a little bit more about forgiveness if I can.
You can do
because
whatever.
That's
I need to get myself together
such
here.
a hard topic.
Man.
I think in my devotions in February, we were going through the book of Job. And it highlighted the fact that Satan, God's enemy, God's, by his own words, is out to destroy and steal and everything from him, right? But Satan comes before God, and they have a casual conversation. Have you ever thought about the implication of that? Think about it. Satan strolls in, and God's like, "So, where have you been? What have you been up to?" It sounds like it's a normal thing, but have you ever thought about that in the context of me or you coming before God? And that regardless of what's in my past, the mistakes I've made, the things I should have done and didn't, I could have done and didn't, in the context of that, if God allows his enemy to come before him, how much more must he delight when you and I choose to come before him? Regardless of what our past has, he doesn't hold that against us. It just...
Wow. So we're looking for a new pastor. Too far right away? Too far?
No, it was thought-provoking. I found it very thought-provoking, like in the context of me feeling that I'm not worthy to stand before God. That none of that is held against me. Yeah. None of that.
Well, and so there's a bunch of things that struck me as you were talking, and that was one of them. And you can see how much it still takes a toll on you is the ability to forgive ourselves.
It's the hardest thing. I can easily forgive you. I can give everyone but myself.
Okay, let's break down some of this stuff because this is some great stuff. One of the things I want to start with is a conversation we had a little bit before this already, and that was to do with dealing with this as a family. So what does that look like? So you touched on Brandon, which again I've never heard a bunch of this stuff. I knew the story kind of loosely, but what was it like for you and George? And what were some of the things that you kind of learned along the way as to how you grieved together as a family? Because I think grief, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but grief tends to bring us to isolation. And so as we grieve, especially with something like this, you start feeling guilty and you start feeling anxious, and so you end up kind of living in your own head more than you necessarily want to talk with everybody. So what did that look like for you and George as you guys navigate through this?
Wow. I think with Brandon, we like I mentioned, we were very wrong in what we thought he would react to. The trauma that he went through was just so hard to watch, because even something simple like a loud truck driving by, because he saw all the first aid response, all the emergency response, the plane, the ambulance, the helicopter, all of that stuff. So he literally just watched every single one because we didn't think to remove him from it. That was not, and looking back, that was the worst thing we should have done.
But in the moment, I mean, you can critique yourself in hindsight, but he was, what you say, 16 months.
Yeah.
I think most of us would have probably
didn't even think about it. Didn't even cross our mind. Oh, he's 16 months. He'll be fine. But I think it was hard to watch how he processed, because like I said, watching him in the nursery go from little girl to little girl, looking for a sister, it just breaks your heart because he can't understand. But at the same time, he also became a comfort, because he would see me sitting and crying, and he would just crawl over or come over and he would wipe my tears and hug me. Right? So it's one of those. Yeah. George and I grieved very different. I want the whole world to stop and to cry with me and to mourn what's been lost. That's how I grieve. Right. George, on the other hand, let's be busy. Okay. If I'm having a rough day, he'll be out. Or if he's having a rough day, he'll be out sundawn till dark and longer if he needs to. Like, let's just stay occupied. So in that sense, we grieve very, very different. But we had to let each other grieve in our own way. One of the analogies I use is we were two people drowning in an ocean. And there was definitely those that thought, oh, they can rescue each other, but you can't. If you're both drowning, you can't rescue each other. So we had to allow both of us to grieve and process in our own way.
Right. Well, I've heard several analogies that way when it comes to even depression, that you're in a hole, you just can't get out. And having somebody else in the hole with you doesn't change the fact that you can't get out. So what is it like? So because I think most married couples do this. We, for whatever reason, we really like ourselves, but we're always attracted to opposites, aren't we?
Yeah.
So how did that work? Like, play that out a little bit more in a practical sense. So how do you work together? Because again, statistically, after the death of a child, marriages don't last. And I would never judge anyone for that because I cannot imagine the pain. I cannot imagine the grief. And the stories are incredibly heart-wrenching. And so this is just a statement of fact. But you guys, you're saying 25 years. I mean, that's a long time to still stay
30.
together, period. Well, afterwards.
25 years after, yeah.
Yes. So it's a long time to stay together, period. What were some of the things that you feel like you guys did right? Because I mean, you're not going home from the hospital going, well, if we do A, B, C, D, and E, we're going to stay together. So it's not like you have a plan because you can't plan for something like this. But what are some things that you felt like we did right moving forward?
Wow, I have thought about that so much, and I don't have many answers. It still goes back to we each had our own journey. We each had our own path that we had to take. And we would have always said that separating wasn't an option. But I think most couples would say that it's not an option. But things happen, right? People change and circumstances change and they impact your reaction to them. I don't have answers. I don't have many answers other than I still think that the primary one was that we did not expect or we just couldn't. I couldn't on a bad day tell George to stay home with me because I was having a bad day. It just wasn't happening.
Right.
And so then there wasn't that expectation from either one of us that I still think that is key.
Well, that's very cool. And I know that's had a significant impact on a lot of people is just the fact that you guys stayed together. I know I've talked, I guess I knew Brandon during youth more than I did necessarily the other girls, but he talked about it quite a bit still. So one of the things you said before that I think would be cool to kind of talk about is a little bit, how do we, so let's say people hearing this story, and let's say they know you or they know somebody else who's gone through this, how do we approach you now? Because I have questions, or if I'm grieving, I mean, this is such a huge conversation, but I don't know what to always say. And I think sometimes when we try to comfort people, we sound ridiculous in the same sense as somebody saying to you, well, at least you guys have each other still. And I know the heart that that's coming from, but clearly it did not have a calming effect. So what would you say to, not just to when approaching you, but in general, like how do you approach somebody who's gone through grief and loss? Because my personality tends to give people space. I struggle to come into somebody's space and be like, you need to talk. You reach out to me, I will go to the ends of the earth. I have no issue with that. But I always feel like I want to give them space.
Especially if we don't know them well.
Right. But then even if you do know them well. So now we've been 25 years. So how do you now, are you okay with people coming up to you, talking to you about it? Do you want people to ask questions, or do you want that to kind of stay in?
It's my story. I think there's a couple of answers to that. I will start with the first few years. There's a time and a place to talk about it. So if you would come up to me on a Sunday morning and say, so how are you today, Sarah? I would have probably given you just fine, thank you. Or it would have been I'm having a really horrible day. Thank you for asking. How are you? And meant it in every sense of the word, because that was the God honest truth.
Yep.
But there's a need to not feel alone in the midst of what you're going through. And one of the things that I hear over and over, well, if you need something, just reach out to me. Reach out to me. Albert, in the beginning, there is no energy for that. Every last ounce of energy is used just to survive. Never mind reaching out, knowing that is what I need. I needed people to reach out to me.
I was going to say, can you give me some examples of stuff that you felt like really helped at the beginning?
Yes. For instance, the one time I ran out of church crying, some trigger again, and somebody followed me and just sat with me. Because God definitely uses people. True. And I look back, and I didn't mention that, but he uses people. There's definitely those that reached out, and they just allowed me to talk. They would just ask. They would take the time to sit down and talk with me and cry with me. I think that for me was so important, to not feel alone. Because all the meals in the world, all the flowers in the world, all the I'm praying for you are awesome and so appreciated. But at the end of the day, I need to know and feel that I'm not alone.
Well, I wonder if that doesn't go back to you were saying there's a time and a place to ask these questions. And one of the things you'd mentioned before that struck me was when you ask the question, do you actually have time to hear the answer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I wonder if that doesn't become one of the crucial things is to actually just give time and to say, I am here. And whether you say nothing or whether you are an open book. So would George say the same? And the reason I ask is, and I know George would speak for himself, but I know I could also never get George on here if I had a lot of money. Even then, I'm not convinced I could get him on here.
Nope,
but
not happening.
so now knowing that you guys grieve different, would that answer stay the same for him? Do you know, I guess?
In a sense, yeah. But he's not as verbal as I am, as many people like to point out.
I don't think he has time to be verbal.
I take up all the space. So, yeah, no, he definitely processes different than I do. So I'm not sure what he would say, actually.
Because I'm just curious again, and because I think there's common things that go across the board. And I think time is going to be one that I've heard from everybody, that spending time and actually pouring into me when I have nothing left. I mean, you can't go wrong with that.
It's the need to not feel alone in it, right? To not feel alone is so, so important.
Right. As we get low here on time, one of the things that I thought maybe you could touch on a bit was the fact that the grief never goes away. And you said something before that struck me, and you said that for other people at like the 5-year mark, you felt like they were almost like, you need to get over it now. It's been 5 years.
Well, that goes back to why I just stopped talking about it, because it consumes your life. Because you don't lose a child and then in 5 years you are able to move on, move past. Like, it just doesn't happen, because you don't forget your child. Right. And mama doesn't forget her child, even if that child is no longer physically present. Mm-hmm. And so that missing is ongoing. I expect it. And if I'm honest with myself, I want it to be there for the rest of my life. Mm-hmm. And that it's okay. It's okay for that missing to be part of who I am. It doesn't go away.
No. Well, and I know I have a vivid image in my head of we had friends who lost their dad when we were teenagers, and the one son had, in the midst of a gathering afterwards where people were laughing because they're together, and just screamed out like, "How can you guys be laughing?"
I still remember the first time I laughed after the funeral. Like, it's one of those things that stays with you. Like, it's almost like you feel guilty for even being happy or even being able to. It's just such a mixed bag of emotions all across the board. Yeah. But to grieve and to not, and regardless of what you're going through, right? If you're in a hard time, to feel like you're not alone. And in a community, we should always reach out and surround each other. But at the end of the day, my primary source of comfort needs to be Jesus. And I think that is something that we often miss, where we look to other people to be our comfort, rather than recognizing that my primary source of comfort is and should always be Jesus first. Because he can comfort and be there in a way that no one else can.
We're going to pick up this conversation in a bit, but we got a 30-minute timer on our camera, so we will be back in a sec. All right, welcome back. We are in part 2 because we ran out of time. But, man, I've really, really appreciated it. So I'm assuming everybody who's watching or listening to this now is going to have listened to the first part. If you have not, make sure you check out part 1 to this. It'll give you a lot more context as to what we're saying. So what we wanted to do is in between here, Sarah, I was saying a little bit, like, you really left me quite speechless. And I think this topic in many ways does for people, because it is. And you started with that. You're living every parent's worst nightmare. I don't know how else to say yes. Like, that is everything. It is terrifying when you are a parent, that thought, even that moment, when you're in a mall and all of a sudden you don't see your kid for a minute, and just that panic, the love that is there between a child and a parent is unreal. I know for me, it's been an interesting dynamic. So I speak a lot on love, and I teach a lot, and I do a lot of different stuff with couples. But it's very interesting to see the difference between a relationship and somebody you choose versus a child.
Yep.
And it's hard to define. Like, I know before we had kids, people would be like, it's going to be like this. And it's nothing like that because you can't actually put words into what that is.
Nope.
I don't know. Like, I had a nephew beforehand, and I'd never really had babies around because we didn't have cousins around here or anything. It was just our family. Like, we're pretty isolated in that regard. And so I'd never really held a child before Damien. And even with Damien, I didn't really know what I was doing. I remember this one. I know this is going way off, but anyways, one of the first times I had Damien by myself for a while, he wouldn't stop screaming. And he must have been like 6 months. And my brother and sister went to a NASCAR race. And Jose had to go uptown to get something. And so he just screamed and screamed. And I was praying. I'm like, God, I don't know what to do. And I'm walking around. I'm holding him. So Josie comes walking in. She's like, did you try the bottle? Never crossed my mind. Oh,
he might be hungry.
So anyways, but then when your own child is born, there is an immediate love there that is hard to even find words for. And you don't know how it started. You don't really it's not like when you're dating where you're kind of like, there was that moment, not that you fell in love, but that first moment you kind of noticed. Like, I have that with Josie. It's grade 9. Mm-hmm. She comes walking around the corner. She's got a white Club Monaco sweatshirt, Adidas pants with a white stripe. She had just gotten a haircut. That moment I was like, right? But with a kid, it's so profoundly deeper.
Mm-hmm. Well, different.
Well, you can say that because that's probably the better word. But it is a different, different. It's just, yes, different. We're not gonna go into semantics here.
Or compare.
Yes.
Because it inevitably leads to comparing loss, and
100%.
that doesn't work.
So the loss of a child is something that, because of how deep that connection is, how different that connection is something every parent fears, and you have lived through that. So we touched on a couple things at the beginning. One of the things I want to touch on again from a faith standpoint now, because one of the things that typically holds us Christians through is the belief that there will come an eternal life, and when we die, we'll be reunited. But the reality is that when you face trauma like this, one of the struggles for most people is to actually stay committed to believe there is a God, because we get lost in why would God allow. So what was that journey for you? I didn't pick that up in the first one that you ever gave up on it. Why not? And how did you journey through that?
I grew up in a church-going family where we attended church Sunday mornings. We went to Wednesday night Bible study, the whole 9 yards. But it was in my later teen years, I got baptized upon my confession of faith. My late teen years, early adult years, I went through an intense personal struggle. And looking back, I think God was preparing me for what He knew was coming. Because there was one specific night it was intense. I battled with identity issues, probably more so than anything else, with my self-worth before God, with all those things. But I fell asleep, very emotionally drained almost. And God showed up. He allowed me to see Him. I don't have any physical characteristics. What I saw was just His eyes full of love. No color, as far as I don't remember that anyway. But I just remember waking up and just going, wow, that was pure love. Sent, looking at me, for me.
Wow.
And I think that was God preparing me for the journey that was coming. So in all the years, I've struggled with many things about God, was He a good God, all those things. But I never once questioned if He was real. That was answered absolutely and definitively.
So how does that play in then? I guess if people listening who don't have faith or don't believe that God exists, how does that play into this then?
I can't imagine going through something that we went through without God. I just can't. Where do you even turn for comfort if there isn't that hope? I don't know how it plays into it, except I know I physically would not be here. I mentally would have lost all my marbles for sure because of how intense that grief is.
Yeah.
And physically, like I mentioned in earlier, is that suicide was never an option because I knew that my God says murder is wrong, taking a life is wrong, and that includes my own life. And that is literally the only thing that stopped me.
Wow.
The depression was intense.
Yeah.
It was deep.
So we're 25 years now removed from that. What was it like? And this is a huge question, but what's parenting like afterwards? How do you function on a day-to-day level now? Because you had 2 daughters afterwards, and you still had a son to raise. What was parenting like? Like, how did you, and I hate to use the word transition, but I'm struggling to find the right word to almost go, you have this part of you that's grieving and feeling at such heavy loss, but then there's the other part where you still have to be a mom and you still have to go on with life. So how did you manage that? And then what was parenting like, and how did you as a family navigate through this?
I still feel sorry for my kids when I think about that, because having lost our daughter through something that I viewed as completely preventable, the term helicopter parenting,
Yeah.
I probably took that to a whole new level. But at the end of the day, I had to learn that even with my best of intentions and all the love in my heart, there is absolutely no way I can always protect my children or do everything right, because there just is no such thing as perfect parenting, as much as I would like to do that.
Right.
So then it goes back to, do I still trust God? Do I do my best as a parent and leave the rest up to God and trust that whatever the outcome, that it'll be okay? And it sounds very flippant saying it, but it always goes back to trust. It always goes back to trust. And that trust, it felt like it was broken after her death. My perception of who God was completely shaken. I knew he was still God. I just didn't think he was a good God. And I wasn't sure that I could trust him with those I loved most, my son and my husband, and the girls that came later. Because how do you even begin to trust again when you lost what you had entrusted to him? Or that's how it felt.
Yeah. Well, it is. It's a hard thing. And I've heard it said before that in the current mindset we have, we want God to answer the questions before we decide whether or not we want to have that relationship.
And we also want to tell him what it should look like and how it should turn out.
The challenge then becomes, is God worth trusting? And I've seen this, and again, grief in some ways plays the same. Not every amount of grief will leave both of us sitting here crying. But grief, whatever that grief is to somebody, grief plays out the same, and a lot of it then begins to trigger on trust.
It does.
And so when you look at this current pandemic, whether or not we trust the government plays into huge as to how we respond to what they're saying and what's happening. So if I have a massive mistrust of the government, then everything they do, I see through that lens.
Yes.
Even though I don't know how I would run a province of 18 million people. I struggle to know how to run a household of like 6 children, right? So it's interesting that idea of trust. So then how did, again, going back to the family a little bit, so you talked about helicopter parenting. Was that something that provided some healing for you, do you figure? Or was that just something where you kind of, and I guess maybe what I'm trying to get at a little bit is the root in the inability to forgive, or is the root in the determination to never allow this to happen again? Because both seem like they could very easily trap you.
And they're probably both things that have to be considered and figured out, right? For me, it started very, very little. I would because I had to choose to trust. It becomes a choice. And so then even something as simple as letting Brandon go with someone else to somebody else's house became a struggle, because now I'm not there to protect him. I need to protect you.
Would you have been like that before? And I
No,
guess
I let her go outside by herself ahead of me. So
yeah, and I know you're giving yourself a very hard, and I'm not going to tell you how to feel about that. But most parents, to some degree, have. I know,
certainly
but
in my case, that became a life.
100%.
Yeah,
100%.
And that's what it goes back to.
Because there's a lot of people who struggle with exactly what you're saying, but have never gone through that trauma. And so that's where I was kind of curious from a parent, because all of us are terrified.
Oh, yeah.
And people are going to listen to this podcast and be even more terrified and be like, ah. But there's a downside. That's a really heavy way to live. And it's a heavy way for kids to live when they feel so controlled. None of us like being controlled. I know you well enough to know you don't like being controlled, right? And so I'd be curious a little bit again, and you've talked about the trust thing and some of that, but I do think that's a challenge for parents in general, is to trust and release control of your kids.
Because we think we have control. We have an illusion of control.
Interesting. This is not at all where this was supposed to go, but what an interesting. What do you mean by that? And I agree with you, but expand on that a little bit.
We think we can control things by the things we do. We will manipulate. Is that a good word in regards? Like think about your teenagers. Yeah. You influence who their friends will be by putting them together with peers and hoping that they will establish friendship and connection. And that's probably all good and fine, but it gives us the illusion of control. That at the end of the day, we now have adult children. Yeah. And then it becomes a whole different ballgame yet with that. Oh, I thought this and this and that, right? And then all of a sudden we realize, oh, they have their own mind. They're making their own choices. Yeah. And am I okay with that? So at the end of the day, can I say, God, I trust you with my children. I will do my best as a parent with these kids that you've entrusted to me. But at the end of the day, I make mistakes. You make mistakes.
Well,
and
I don't,
more
but I know what
often
you're
than
saying.
not, we traumatize our kids by the things we do and we say.
Yeah.
But somewhere's in there, I need to believe that God will work it out, that he will take my feeble offerings at child raising, and he will make something beautiful out of it, because that's what he does, right? He takes our... Does that make sense?
It does. But I think, again, so we've been talking as a church a lot about convictions, and those are those deep-rooted things that you don't necessarily say, but those are the deep, confident things. And one of the things that you're really touching on is, how much do I think God is actually a part of this and in control of this?
Mm-hmm. And how much do I think I am? Or not even think. I might think that God is, but when it comes right down to the nitty-gritty, do I actually live out what I say or think I am? And there's a difference there. Right. Because something like what we went through, what it does more than anything else is highlight just where your faith is at. Yeah. And in my case, it needed some deep rooting.
Right. Well, and there's a piece of that where there's a lot of maturity that's gained as you go through sufferings in life. Now, again, none of us ever want to suffer. We do a lot to avoid it. Oh, 100%. I mean, we work incredibly hard in our culture to avoid any of that suffering. Yep. But it is often through suffering that I think we become appreciative of what we have, but it also gives us opportunities to really see a lot of our own shortcomings.
Yeah.
So let me get to one more thing here. I won't keep prying and prodding, but there's so much to be learned. And I think having this conversation, I hope at least, triggers people to have different conversations about even their view on kids. Can I control my teenagers? That's a huge question, because your parenting doesn't stop after they leave the house. My wife sent a post today that I thought was hilarious. She sent it to her mother. She said, the post said, her saying to her mom, when do these kids get less needy? And then mom responds, well, you're a mid-30-something calling me, so... Because that never ends. And so it becomes something that you when you can accept that they have their own freedom, their own agency, I think that's part of what makes even loving grandchildren easier.
Maybe.
You can't control that? I don't know.
No, it's just not having to be concerned about their manners.
Really, that's the big thing.
You don't have to discipline and train them. You can just enjoy them. But anyway.
My dad would amen to that.
Yeah.
My boys often at my dad's place will make jokes around the dinner table that had I made
Oh,
at
gosh,
that age,
they would have never. No.
and I'm like, Dad, how are we okay with this? And he's laughing. And I'm like, where was that laughter when I was a kid? Okay, so let's talk from what you've learned. What are some of the things you'd say to others who are going through grief? I know there's no cut and dry answer, and there's no cut and paste. And even between you and George, some of this stuff would be different. If I were to interview him, he might say different things. But from your personality and from your experience as a mom, what are some of the things that you would say, hey, take note of this, some of the things I think you should do to help you as you navigate through that?
Through parenting or through grief?
Grief.
Through grief?
Sometimes those words are used interchangeably.
Feelings aren't valid. Well, that's not true. They are valid. That's not what I meant. Feelings can't dictate your response to a situation. I think more than anything else. Feelings are valid because God created them. But too often, I allowed my feelings to be my response rather than going back to what I knew about Jesus. And I needed to learn to do that instead of going to my friends, I needed to go back to Jesus and to be reminded of what he promises in regards to myself, in regards to my children. And that's not to say that the greater community is always good. But at the end of the day, Jesus is my first authority and what he says, because that influences so much of how I respond and react. I'm not a parenting expert.
No, you did fine though. I mean, Brandon, we're all a little bit questionable about, but the rest are fine. No, and back to the feelings thing. I think feelings can very easily lead you down dark paths very quick. Feelings aren't necessarily confined by rational thought. They're not confined to truth. They become whatever. I should just go die by suicide. That's what I should do. That's how this would end. Well, rationally, that's not realistic. And I think a lot of the stuff then that we end up feeling through, I mean, feelings are awesome. That's part of the joy in life.
For sure.
But to realize that feelings
they can also lie to you.
100%.
They can also lie to you, and it's to be aware of that.
And so I guess then for us, we would say the truth, again, we would find in Jesus. And I think that's one of the things for people of faith. You go back to Jesus says he's the way, the truth, and the life. And I think that's kind of where you're kind of getting at for you. That was the thing.
It was.
If I can't trust my feelings, which I know I can't, and we can't, none of us can, where do you go to find truth about this situation? And so for you, that was a huge part of it was going back to Jesus. And I mean, I would fully affirm that because anything else doesn't. And as a pastor, I mean, I'd like to say I would, if you would have gone to me, I would have been like, this is what, I don't know what to do. Like, we're both lost. In this interview, you've seen me at multiple places just kind of go, and I'm not really short for words very often. It's so hard.
Yeah.
And I think that's why we cling to our faith so much in dark times, is because typically they're dark because we have to give up control because there's situations that we can no longer control.
And to recognize those limits, right? There is so much, like even the very breath that I breathe is out of my control. Like at any time, something can happen and I no longer have breath. And to recognize that, you know what, ultimately, I am created by a creator and he gives hope.
Okay, awesome. I think that's a great tone to end off on. I've taken a good amount of your time. Really appreciate it, Sarah. Say from the bottom of my heart. I am one of those people who have known of the story sort of, and I've talked to your kids a little bit, but it's one of those that I never really had a chance to talk with you about. And so really thankfully you came on, you shared It has given me a lot of insight, a lot of tears. But I've really appreciated it. To anyone listening, again, if this has triggered something, please reach out. This is incredibly hard, and watching you 25 years later still wrestling through it has really, again, reminded me of how powerful grief is, but also how powerful love is. And when you love someone, that doesn't end simply because they die, and caring about that person. And so whether that's, somebody, a friend you lost, a child you lost, or some other kind of grief, please reach out. And whether that's us putting you in contact with Sarah, or just myself or Patrick or somebody here talking, we'd love to chat with you. So with that, thanks again. Thanks for joining. Well, we'll see you next time.